Okay, let's unpack this. The sources you've shared today present, I think, one of the most intellectually ambitious deep dives we've ever taken.
It's quite a collection.
It really is. We're tackling this fundamental conflict between, the individual self and these massive, often invisible systems that are trying to define us or exploit us or, in some very rare cases, maybe save us.
It's an extraordinary mix. You've got critiques of medical authority right next to economic philosophy, and then you have moral lessons from, of all places, post-apocalyptic fiction.
Right.
But what links them all is this central anxiety. It's about the mechanics of control, and I think more alarmingly, the distortion of reality itself.
From the reality inside a single person's mind all the way up to the global market.
Exactly.
So that's our mission today. We're going to follow that thread. We're exploring this really intense, often hidden battle for autonomy and for reality.
We have to understand how these large impersonal systems, whether they're clinical, political, financial, how they maintain control by manufacturing crisis and blurring the very definition of truth.
And then the big question. When all those external structures fail, what is that? That irreducible, essential human quality that's left.
Which brings us to the key question that's going to guide this whole analysis for you, the listener. If the foundations of your external life, the economy, the government, the social contract, if they all start to erode.
And even if your own internal compass, your sense of self, is called into question.
Then what bedrock principles determine who you fundamentally are and what you truly believe?
Okay, so we're starting where control feels the most. The most visceral and intimate, right? Inside the mental landscape. The sources argue that this modern struggle for autonomy, it really starts with the historical tension that's just baked into the provider-patient relationship.
Yeah.
And this issue was amplified dramatically by the anti-psychiatry movement.
And this isn't just old history. This is a living, breathing debate about freedom versus, mandated restoration. And that critique has really deep roots. Long before the big philosophical movements of the 60s, the most persistent critics of psychiatry were often the people who had experienced the system firsthand.
Former mental hospital patients.
Right. But they ran into a predictable wall. They just didn't have the professional credibility to effectively confront the medical establishment.
And we see this play out perfectly with the story of Clifford W. Beers in the early 1900s. His book from 1908, A Mind That Found Itself, it was a bombshell.
A total bombshell. It publicized the horrific mistreatment he saw, and he initially, and rightly, condemned psychiatrists for their complicity, or at least their negligence.
And this is such a crucial point, he later had to soften his hostility.
He had to. He had to compromise. To get any reform done, he needed institutional support, he needed funding. Specifically to get his National Committee for Mental Hygiene off the ground.
So it's the strategic retreat that shows the immense power disparity. To fix the system, Beers had to dilute his original, much more radical critique.
It's a perfect illustration of how radical truth often needs to be sanitized just to get access to the centers of power.
And this dissent wasn't just happening in the U.S. Our sources confirm the term anti-psychiatry was already being used in Germany around the same time.
Which shows the concern wasn't just about local abuses. It was this transnational recognition of the inherent coercive power structure of institutional psychiatry.
Then the philosophical backbone of the movement arrives with Thomas Says.
Yes, especially with his famous or infamous argument about the myth of mental illness.
So what was he actually saying? He wasn't denying that people suffer, was he?
No, not at all. He wasn't denying distress. He was defining mental illness as an incoherent philosophical combination, a muddling of medical, biological concepts with things that are purely psychological or even moral.
And as a pretty hardline libertarian, saw this diagnostic label not just as confused, but as actively dangerous.
Oh, absolutely. He fiercely opposed its use to forcibly detain someone or mandate treatment or, and this is key, to excuse behavior that he saw as just mere deviance from what society expects.
His core concern was that the whole system stripped the individual of moral agency.
Precisely. If you define not conforming morally, socially, existentially as a disease, you completely undermine that person's rights and their moral responsibility.
He even rejected the anti-psychiatry label for himself, didn't he?
He did, because he saw the movement as often leftist and collectivist, whereas his entire focus was on radical individual liberty. But still, his argument about the mythical nature of diagnosis, it became foundational for everyone challenging coercive methods.
And that philosophical challenge, it led to the development of concrete, non-coercive alternatives. We hear names like R.D. Laing and his therapeutic communities like Kingsley Hall. But what did that actually look like in practice? How did they work without the usual hierarchy?
Well, that's where the real insight is. Places like Kingsley Hall and later the Soteria houses in the U.S., they were these radical attempts to just validate the subjective experience of the patient.
To treat the person, not the supposed disease inside them.
Yes. The idea was that residents and staff were, in theory, equals. Decisions were often collective, and crucially, medication was completely voluntary.
So if someone was in an acute crisis, what did non-coercion actually look like? Did they just let the crisis play out, or were there other methods?
The focus was on radical acceptance and human presence. Instead of chemical restraints, you had an environment that was highly structured but completely non-judgmental.
So lots of talking.
Intensive, continuous dialogue. Staff would just stay with individuals in crisis for hours, sometimes days, not trying to fix the experience, but to bear witness to it, to help the person navigate their own subjective reality back towards some kind of coherence.
And the success of places like the Soteria houses, which focused on early psychosis, really shows that these non-psychiatric models can be effective.
It directly challenges the idea that coercion is a medical necessity.
The ultimate vulnerability here, and the sources really stress this, is the diagnosis itself. Alan Francis, a psychiatrist who actually helped create the DSM-IV.
Right, he was on the inside.
Exactly. He pointed out in 2013 that diagnosis still relies exclusively on, and I'm quoting, fallible subjective judgments rather than objective biological tests.
There's no blood test for anxiety.
Yeah.
There's no brain scan for schizophrenia.
It's all subjective, and that subjective core is the point of entry for abuse.
And that entry point has been exploited throughout history for systemic and political control. I mean, we have to remember the chilling example of Samuel A. Cartwright identifying drapetomania.
The supposed ailment that caused enslaved people to desire freedom.
It's the ultimate terrifying illustration, redefining a legitimate human desire liberty as a pathological, treatable disease that threatens the social order.
So a power structure diagnoses nonconformity as a sickness, which gives it medical permission to enforce the status quo.
And Zaz argued this goes way beyond just historical misuse. The issue isn't just a few bad doctors. It's the political power that is inherent in the psychiatrist's social role.
How so?
Well, unlike other subjective professionals, say a music critic or an art curator or a plastic surgeon, the psychiatrist possesses state-legitimated power.
The power to deprive individuals of their liberty,
their property, even their life through involuntary commitment. The classification itself, regardless of clinical accuracy, is a tool of state power that can bypass due process in a way no other subjective profession can.
So Saz was basically saying Western psychiatrists were hypocrites for condemning their Soviet counterparts for political abuse.
When democratic societies grant them the exact same coercive power, just cloaked in the language of clinical necessity.
This profound tension brings us to the core ethical question in this literature. Does enforcing treatment restrict a person's autonomy? Or is their mental illness the source of their autonomy restriction, with the treatment trying to restore it?
That is the high-stakes philosophical battlefield.
And to even start answering that, we have to define autonomy precisely. It literally means self-governance, but the sources break it down.
Right, it's not a monolith. You have dimensions like liberty, which is freedom from interference, agency, the ability to act, decisional capacity, the cognitive ability to weigh choices.
And authenticity. Whether the choice truly reflects the person's real values.
And the distinction we absolutely have to get our heads around is between procedural and substantive autonomy.
Okay, procedural autonomy sounds like it's about the process, the how.
It is. It's just about the process. Did the person make the choice freely? Were they capable of understanding the information? It doesn't judge the choice itself.
But substantive autonomy,
Yeah.
that's where it gets complicated.
It gets very complex because it's value-laden. It argues that some preferences are just inherently impermissible.
Can you give us a strong analogy for that? What does it mean for a preference to be impermissible, even if it's freely chosen?
Well, think about the hypothetical scenario of choosing to be enslaved. A person who is legally and cognitively capable might say, I autonomously choose to become property.
Procedurally, that might check out. They chose it freely and they knew what they were doing.
Exactly. But a substantive autonomy theorist would say, the choice to surrender your fundamental human rights is inherently incompatible with the concept of a self-governing person. It collapses the idea of self-rule into what critics call right rule.
Meaning others know what is right for you, even if you disagree.
Precisely.
And that distinction makes clinical reality just impossibly difficult to navigate. Take, for example, a patient with anorexia nervosa who's severely malnourished but is refusing a feeding tube.
A perfect and tragic example. If that person refuses treatment but privately says they wish they could desire food, that's a conflicted desire, you could argue their autonomy is diminished.
Because their primary desire to live is being blocked by a secondary pathological one to restrict.
Right. And so an intervention in that case could be framed as autonomy promoting. You're trying to restore their true, deep-seated desire to thrive.
But what if they don't have that conflicted desire? What if they endorse the condition completely? They see it as their purpose, their raison d'etre. They see their low weight as an achievement.
That's the ethical quicksand. Critics of intervention would argue this is a demonstration of pure, albeit tragic, autonomy.
Yet clinicians operating under that substantive autonomy idea might argue that the condition itself so severely distorts their reality that this endorsement is actually evidence of severe illness, not autonomy.
The system struggles to tolerate choices that lead directly to death, regardless of how endorsed they are.
And this is where the concept of paternalism comes in, specifically temporal paternalism.
Limiting short-term autonomy to secure greater long-term autonomy. Yes, it's often formalized using what are called Ulysses contracts.
Named after the Greek hero who had himself tied to the mast to resist the siren song.
That's the one. These are pre-commitment directives. A patient, while they're competent, decides on a course of treatment for a future state of incompetence.
So, if a patient has bipolar disorder and knows they become erratic and refuse treatment during a manic episode, they sign a contract.
Right. It basically says, when I reach that state, I consent to forced treatment. It allows the patient's future, healthy self to dictate care over their currently competent but pathologically altered self.
But the anti-psychiatry view would see this as completely illegitimate.
Fundamentally, they would argue that the patient's current refusal is the authentic, autonomous choice of their present self. To override it is to violate their liberty and inflict trauma.
But the clinical reality, as the sources show, is, well, it's mixed.
It is. While enforcing treatment is traumatic, large-scale studies show a substantial number of patients retrospectively approve of the coercive treatment they received. They look back and they thank the system for saving them from their temporary self.
Validating the temporal paternalism view.
But a large percentage still disapprove, reporting trauma and violation. So the final assessment is coercion, autonomy promoting, or autonomy restricting. It's this delicate, ethically charged clinical challenge.
It requires an evolving idea of what constitutes the patient's true or deep self.
A concept that is almost impossible to define outside of shared community values. The psychiatric prism really shows us the stakes of defining and controlling an individual's reality.
So that intense internal struggle, that battle for one's own mind, it really does mirror a much larger societal struggle.
It's a perfect parallel.
If authority can define deviance inside the clinic, then the larger systems, the economic and political ones, they're experts at defining and controlling our external reality.
And this is where the analysis gets truly provocative. We're moving from the contested individual self to the systems that corrupt our shared social reality.
It starts with the idea that as traditional religious authority began to wane in the West, a kind of spiritual vacuum was created.
And nature, as they say, abhors a vacuum. Secular ideologies just rushed in to fill that void.
And they often adopted the same intensity, the same dogma and zeal that was previously reserved for faith.
This isn't just about political preferences. This is about the emotional and existential function that belief systems serve. Ideologies like fascism, communism, nationalism, they didn't just offer policy.
They offered dogmas. They demanded absolute loyalty.
And they provided new, secular answers to the old spiritual questions of meaning, purpose, and community.
This is where, as the sources say, the faithful become the corrupted.
Right. When these belief systems get twisted into instruments of power, they become chains that bind and blind their followers. Totalitarian movements like Nazism and fascism understood this perfectly. They became textbook examples of political religion.
They borrowed all the pageantry, the myth-making, the idea of a restored Roman Empire, the promise of a 1,000-year Reich.
They weren't just creating political parties. They were constructing alternative spiritual realities, where the leaders were messianic figures and just being a member was a form of sacred piety.
And the sources argue that this same structural religious fervor applies most powerfully to our economic sphere today. That capitalism and consumerism have effectively become the dominant secular theology of the masses.
And it's a theology that demands relentless hunger and perpetual desire, not fulfillment.
So let's break that down. This idea of capitalism as a secular religion. What's the creed? And who are the priests?
The core creed is this unquestioning belief in continuous exponential growth. It's a metaphysical requirement that directly clashes with physical limits.
And the priesthood?
That would be the economists, the CEOs, the central bankers, the financial analysts who interpret the seemingly divine, chaotic will of the market.
And the moral narrative is everywhere. Success is framed as the ultimate virtue, material accumulation as piety.
And lack of wealth is seen as a moral failing or a lack of individual effort.
The critique gets genuinely chilling when you look at the internal, self-destructive nature of this theology. Marx famously described capital as being like a vampire, sucking the living labor out of the worker.
But the sources argue that today, it's even more monstrous than that. It is actively auto-cannibalistic.
Self-cannibalizing.
The system requires the violent destruction of capital as a condition of its own self-preservation.
So what does that mean in practice?
Well, when profit rates start to decline, maybe because of market saturation or higher wages or more competition, the system doesn't just slow down. It demands a clearing event.
A financial crisis, a war, a pandemic.
Hyperinflation. These events wipe out weaker competitors, they devalue assets, they centralize wealth, and that allows the cycle of accumulation to restart from a much higher base of power.
This is the mechanism by which the so-called devouring class operates. They aren't just passively wealthy, they are actively positioned to capitalize on systemic destruction.
We saw this perfectly after 2008. The failure of the system led to these massive transfers of public wealth into private hands, consolidating power among the very institutions that caused the collapse in the first place.
So you can't just hope to oppose the system through negativity.
Because the system already mobilizes far greater negativity, financial crises, climate chaos, perpetual conflict, than any force we could mount against it. It regenerates itself through crisis. It consumes itself and sheds the weaker parts to ensure the survival of the strongest.
This irrational, crisis-driven logic creates a really bizarre paradox in our society.
It does. Capitalism generates all this technological abundance and efficiency that should ensure universal well-being.
But it necessitates the deliberate creation of lack to drive consumption and profit.
Exactly. If every desire were genuinely fulfilled, if we all had durable goods, free education, abundant time, the engine would stall. So the system has to impose scarcity right in the middle of plenty. It has to constantly generate new wants, new anxieties, new perceived deficiencies to keep us buying and laboring.
And this requires rewarding a specific, destructive kind of drive. The sources make a really crucial distinction between greed and avarice.
Right. Greed, they argue, is a primal survival skill, wanting more for yourself and your tribe.
But avarice is different.
Avarice is greed on steroids gone wrong. It's the irrational desire to have everything, regardless of the cost to others. The to hell with everyone else mentality.
And the system is structurally designed to reward avarice.
Tragically, yes. It promotes those who are willing to externalize all costs and liquidate the value held by everyone else.
Which ensures no one is ever truly autonomous or free. This brings us right back to part one. A person who is completely debt-free, financially, mentally, spiritually, is fundamentally dangerous to this architecture of control.
Absolutely. If you are not fearful of losing your job, your health, your housing, you cannot be controlled or manipulated by the threat of precarity. The system must ensure a constant state of obligation.
Whether it's a mortgage, student loans, or just the mental debt of keeping up with an impossible standard of performance and consumption.
And this pressure also corrupts our very identity. Identity stops being something you discover through reflection or struggle.
And becomes something you manufacture to be sold and consumed. Your personal worth becomes inseparable from your economic function.
Yes, your identity is increasingly an asset that has to hold value, and it's often measured in outrage or attention. The authenticity you project is manufactured for marketability. If you are not performing, you are not valuable.
Which turns genuine human connection into transactional networking.
And self-expression into content creation.
Let's transition now to the most direct form of this control. The systematic corruption of truth and language. The sources argue that systems preserve power by actively drowning out the possibility of independent thought.
The dissolution of contemplation is a necessity for the system.
It's not a coincidence that we live in a world where every single empty moment has to be filled with noise.
A podcast, a video, a scrolling feed. The function is to ensure that people are never alone with their own minds long enough to see the strings of the manufactured illusion, to question the foundational premises of the system they're in.
And this deliberate noise is compounded by the corruption of language itself. Language, the very foundation of human understanding, stops being a tool to describe truth.
And becomes a tool of manipulation to serve power. The function of words is redefined. They're used to shape perception and bend the mind toward a desired, politically expedient reality.
And this is achieved by systematically training us to speak in ways that make opposing thoughts linguistically or morally impossible to even say out loud.
Yes. For example, look at how dissent is often framed. If questioning a policy is immediately labeled hate speech, it bypasses debate entirely.
Debate becomes impossible because the dissenter has already been categorized as immoral or violent.
Or if challenging an authority figure is framed as insurrection or violence, critical thought is silenced. The power structure uses language not to describe reality, but to create a prescriptive reality where certain thoughts cannot exist safely.
This brings us to Hannah Arendt's chilling warning about totalitarianism. She observed that when everyone lies constantly, or when the truth becomes so convoluted that it's indistinguishable from falsehood,
people lose the capacity to discern factual truth altogether. She said that the constant lying deprives the individual of its capacity to think and to judge.
And this state of pervasive confusion, cynicism, and information overload, it just makes the populace completely malleable to tyranny.
If you can't trust what you see or read or hear, you surrender the responsibility of judgment to whoever screams the loudest or provides the simplest narrative.
And today, this war on truth isn't just fought with simple, blunt lies.
No, it's fought with a torrent of contradictory information, moral relativism, and overwhelming complexity. And it's all amplified by advanced technology. We are swimming in an AI-generated digital babble where truth and falsehood, manufactured content, and authentic experience just coexist indistinguishably.
And this systemic chaos ensures that even political structures that look democratic on the surface are completely hollowed out.
Democracy is maintained as a facade, while the real power shifts behind the curtain to the donor class and lobbyists who control the funding and the legislative agenda.
The system's survival, then, hinges on perpetual staged conflict, the endless culture wars, the polarizing rhetoric, the tribal media cycles.
These are necessary mechanisms to keep the populace permanently distracted, angry, and dependent on strong, often authoritarian leadership to maintain order against all the perceived chaos.
So elections, in this model, they become an empty ritual, a meaningless performance where the choices presented to the public are tightly controlled and funded by the same narrow interests.
And this is what the sources are calling theocratic democracy. Not because a church rules the state, but because the people have this misplaced religious faith in the forms of democracy.
The voting, the campaigns, the rhetoric.
Without realizing that the substance of control lies with different gods, the market, and the state apparatus.
So the ultimate false choice presented by this corrupted reality is what? Submission to an authoritarian who promises order, or submission to endless consumption?
Both paths result in the same thing: the surrender of independent thought and moral autonomy.
So if Part I exposed the contested self and Part II revealed these corrupted systems of control, we have to ask, what happens when that controlled decay accelerates into total existential failure?
Right.
I mean, what does this all mean when the whole system of manufactured reality fails? What's the survival strategy then?
This is where we move into the high-stakes realm of crisis and collapse.
Yeah.
And post-apocalyptic literature serves a really powerful function here. It's a critical simulation tool.
A simulation? How so?
By stripping away that thin veneer of civilization, these stories force us to confront what essential human qualities are retained, and more importantly, what qualities are required for survival beyond just animal instinct.
And the range of threats they simulate is just vast.
It is. You start with technological threats, the fear of an AI takeover, or the singularity, where intelligence just accelerates beyond human control and makes us obsolete.
Then you have the biological threats, global pandemics, like the MM88 virus and the film virus, or that man-made plague that targets only women in Frank Herbert's The White Plague.
Those scenarios test social cohesion under the pressure of unstoppable biological devastation.
And then there are the sociological threats, which are about total systemic failure, cyber warfare, collapsing Western infrastructure, like in All Systems Down, or the chilling vision of nuclear holocaust.
Whether that's the destruction of 23 U.S. cities in the show Jericho, or even the bizarre aftermath of the Great Mushroom War in Adventure Time.
And finally, you've got the astronomical threats, which remind us that control is fundamentally an illusion against the cosmos.
A rogue planet collision, a cataclysmic asteroid impact, a nearby hypernova that just sterilizes the planet.
But the mechanism of collapse is almost secondary. What's absolutely fascinating is that regardless of whether the threat is technological or viral or astronomical, the narrative always seems to converge on a single moral test:
the necessity of compassion and empathy for humanity's eventual survival.
This is perfectly demonstrated in Philip K. Dick's Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, with its famous Voight empathy test.
Right. The key difference between a human and the Nexus 6 android isn't intellect or appearance. The androids are virtually indistinguishable. The test measures the speed and depth of the subject's emotional response to suffering.
Especially the suffering of animals. It links compassion to the very fabric of life.
And the androids fail because they lack that fundamental moral capacity, the ability to recognize and value the intrinsic suffering of another living being.
So it suggests that true humanity isn't a physical state or an IQ score. It's a moral capacity. It's the intrinsic value we place on every life, even the inconspicuous, non-human ones.
The post-apocalyptic narrative thus acts as this psychological simulation. It forces emotional and ethical growth. By showing suffering, the wounds, the hunger, the loss in graphic detail, it makes the reader engage in this imaginative roleplay.
It activates the very empathic circuits that the larger systems we talked about in Part 2 are trying to suppress with noise and distraction. The ultimate stakes of this moral test are so powerfully illustrated in Cormac McCarthy's novel, The Road. The father is driven by this utilitarian survival ethic, and it borders on a blinding hate for anyone outside their tiny unit of two.
He steals, he avoids, he risks losing his own humanity in this desperate effort to preserve his son's physical life.
But the son, who is the one carrying the fire, he rejects that utilitarian calculus. When they encounter and rob a starving thief, the son cries with this profound empathy.
He recognizes their shared humanity, their shared misery. And when the father dismissively tries to console him, the boy responds with this devastating clarity, "But we did kill him."
The weight of that moral choice threatens to consume the son, but his capacity for compassion is the only thing that proves he is worth saving.
The novel suggests that the son's uncompromising moral sense, his ability to feel the suffering of the other, is absolutely essential to humankind's future. It's the marker of humanity that has to be preserved at all costs, even above tactical survival.
If we connect this moral struggle to the broader nature of consciousness itself, the sources introduce a really fascinating philosophical framework: the Gnostic simulation idea.
This is a complex jump, so let's be careful here.
Okay, so what does Gnosticism propose about our reality?
Gnosticism suggests that our physical reality is a flawed imitation. It's a prison. It's not the perfect creation of a true benevolent God, but a deterministic world, which the Greeks called ermarmi, or fate, that was crafted by a lesser ignorant god called the demiurge.
So the demiurge is the architect of this imperfect prison, and he has assistants called the archons. Who are they?
The archons are the cosmic jailers. Their role is to enforce that deterministic fate, to keep souls distracted, ignorant, and trapped within the material world, completely unaware of their own divine, higher origin.
So they distract us with material concerns, false promises, all the chaos we talked about in Part 2.
Exactly. And in this framework, our near-death experiences or moments of profound, inexplicable insight, they might be interpreted as glitches in the interface.
Moments where the veil between the simulation and base reality things and the trapped consciousness, the true divine spark, momentarily overwhelms the avatar's physical programming.
And the profound implication of that is that we are not the code. We're not the characters in the simulation. We're the consciousness for which the code is run. We're the audience and the purpose of the experience.
We are a being far greater and more fundamental than the physical form it currently inhabits.
Our joy and our sorrow are real because we are real, and our true self resides outside the control of the archons.
This philosophical separation between our limited physical experience and our deeper nature, it finds this fascinating coherence in Henri Bergson's dualistic philosophy.
Yes. Bergson argued that our typical human perception divides reality into these discrete spatial units, things, and spaces, with a view toward action and utility.
For utility, we measure time in seconds and space in inches.
But Bergson suggests that true reality, the underlying matter, isn't composed of these neat divisions. True reality is an indivisible becoming. It's a continuous flow, a single, uninterrupted duration.
I think of it like watching a movie. Your conscious mind sees distinct frames moving quickly. But the true reality of the film is the continuous projection of light, the flow of the celluloid, which only appears discrete because your brain separates it for analysis. The true reality is the flow.
That's a perfect analogy. Bergson suggests our physical existence, when you resolve it to its deepest level, consists of numberless vibrations all linked together in an uninterrupted continuity. The separation we feel is an artifact of our perception, designed so we can effectively grab and manipulate objects.
And this provides a powerful metaphysical foundation for why empathy is a survival necessity. If reality is, at its base, an undivided extensity,
then there is truly no ontological separation between persons. Our existence is fundamentally shared because we share this single, invisible flow.
So to be social isn't just a political choice, it's making history together. It's acting in line with our deepest reality.
And when we choose hate or selfishness or apathy, we are acting against our shared ontological nature. The moral test of collapse, the demand for compassion, is not just a sentimental idea. It reflects the underlying truth that we are inherently connected, and that survival is a collective endeavor rooted in recognizing that shared being.
So we have journeyed through immense complexity here, from the micro-coercion of psychiatric power to the macro-corruption of global capitalism and the war on truth, and finally, to the existential test of collapse that demands empathy.
We face two crises: the corruption of our external systems and the corruption of our inner landscape of autonomy and truth.
The synthesis, I think, is clear. The systems of control, whether it's theocratic democracy or the market is God, they rely on the individual being distracted, anxious, fearful, and in perpetual survival mode.
If you are constantly struggling just for existence, you cannot think critically or fight for autonomy.
Therefore, the antidote to this systemic corruption has to be a dual process: reclaiming control over our external economic conditions and reclaiming our internal attention.
The sources outline practical, structural antidotes, and they start with economic reform.
Reducing the anxiety of survival is the absolute precondition for any meaningful civic or political engagement.
Which means reinforcing robust social safety nets. Ideas like a universal basic income, guaranteed health care, stable housing. These are not just humanitarian measures. They are essential tools for restoring autonomy.
By providing a floor, these systems free people from the sword of Damocles, that constant paralyzing fear of losing everything.
And when people aren't preoccupied with base survival, they are empowered to participate in dialogue, to think long-term, and to resist exploitation. It directly restores personal and political agency.
Then there's the urgent need for civic renewal, restoring public spaces dedicated to genuine dialogue and inquiry.
Which means investing heavily in civic infrastructure like free public libraries, nonpartisan community forums, and deliberative models of government like citizens' councils.
The goal here is to ensure that citizens are actively trained in dialogistai, the art of conversation and inquiry.
Which is Socratic in origin. It means structured, rigorous conversation that's aimed at jointly searching for truth, rather than just winning an argument or reciting dogma.
And structured dialogue is essential for combating the war on truth. When citizens learn how to listen and question evidence and engage in informed, fact-based debate,
they naturally resist the polarizing rhetoric and tribal narrative warfare that is designed to distract them from the real structural issues.
And finally, spiritual vigilance. What does that mean?
It means nurturing an authentic faith, whether that's in truth, justice, or compassion, that acts as a guiding principle, rather than allowing belief systems to be weaponized into instruments of oppression. We have to ensure that human-centric values, dignity, autonomy, the sanctity of life, are the non-negotiable foundations.
The sources make a chilling prediction if we fail to do this, to execute this dual reclamation.
We risk sliding into a technocratic authoritarian future where these digital monopolies function as techno-feudal lords, controlling both the means of production and the flow of information, effectively turning the populace into digital zombies trapped in a content vortex.
We talked earlier about the devouring class, those who profit from crisis and the controlled decay of the system. The sources suggest a final critical insight here.
When the system finally collapses, having extracted all possible value, the devouring class will be gone. They will have retreated into their untouchable enclaves, leaving the vast majority to face the aftermath.
This controlled dystopia is only averted by a conscious revelation of truth and a collective reassertion of our deepest values.
So the final choice facing you, the listener, is not merely submission or consumption. It's whether you will assert the sacredness of human-centric values, love, dignity, and truth, as the foundation for rebuilding civilization.
The Bergsonian view compels us to recognize that our existence is shared, that we are fundamentally connected. And if we accept this, the final act of resistance is the compassionate choice.
Recognizing that the economy, the political structure, and the tools of technology must be the servants of humanity, not the masters that are allowed to devour it.